Well, hello everyone. Thank you for attending today's invited lecture, the name of which is The Evergreen State, Our Legacy, Our Future. And it's sponsored by the College of Agricultural, Human and Natural Resource Sciences, the College of Arts and Sciences, the School of the Environment, and the Thomas S. Foley Institute for Public Policy and Public Service, where you are right now, as you know. I'm Ron Middlehammer, and I'm the Dean of the College of Agricultural, Human and Natural Resource Sciences, and I'm honored to welcome Dr. Peter Goldmark back to WSU. Peter Goldmark is the 13th Commissioner of Public Lands since statehood in 1889, and the 5th Commissioner to manage the Department of Natural Resources, which was an agency assuming its current form in 1957. He was elected by the people of Washington in 2008 and began his first four-year term January of 2009. He was re-elected in November of 2012 and served a second four-year term as Commissioner of Public Lands. I've had, by the way, the distinct honor of serving with Dr. Goldmark in the past 3.5 years in my capacity as a member of the Board of Natural Resources, which the Commissioner leads. And I can assure you those meetings that I'm attending with Dr. Goldmark in the leadership of those meetings, they are crisp, they are on time, they are informative, and they are very valuable to inform public policy. A scientist by training and a Washington native, Goldmark was raised on his family's ranch in the Okanagan Highlands. After receiving his Ph.D. in molecular biology from the University of California, Berkeley in 1971, he traveled to Harvard University for a postdoctoral fellowship in neurobiology. In 1972, he returned to Washington to raise his family, run his own business, and make life as a rancher. You'll also be interested to know that Dr. Goldmark has been an active wildland firefighter for over 30 years. Please join me in welcoming Commissioner Peter Goldmark.
Thank you, Ron, and good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here today. Ron didn't exactly spell it out, but I've been around this campus for many years, starting in 1988, first as a visiting scientist, and then as a member of the Board of Regents from 1996 until 2005. So yes, I have great affection for this institution, and it's with pleasure that I come back to talk about an urgent issue, and that is a warming climate that is happening globally, which has dramatic impact and dramatic potential impact over the coming years. I speak about this today because the impact of a warming climate is very real, and it's had an impact already. And I think many people are unaware of the true dimension of what's happening, and also the opportunity to get involved and to make a difference. So today I want to talk about DNR's programs, our responsibilities, and some individuals from across the state who are making and have made a big difference in how we as a state respond to the urgent reality of a changing climate. So to get started, Ron mentioned the title. I'm concerned about two things. The legacy that we were given at statehood, and I'll talk briefly about that in terms of trust lands, but also how those lands are going to be affected by not only the climate and weather today, but what is frankly inbound. So this is a slide from 2012. This is a fire approaching the city of Wenatchee. Now, DNR has a large responsibility fighting wildfire. We have often over 1,200 people that respond, over 100 fire engines, helicopters, and aircraft. On this fire, we responded along with many other responders. Why? Because people's lives were at risk. People's property was at risk. The town of Wenatchee was under dire risk. We spent millions of dollars fighting this fire, as we do many other fires. That's how we respond to emergencies. Well, there's this other emergency which is occurring. And I want to just bring up this slide to just briefly show you temperature is across here over 800,000 years. That's right, 800,000 years of Earth's history derived from the ice cores Antarctica. And it shows temperature going up and down within a given range. And it shows CO2, which is a greenhouse gas, and methane, mimicking, if not driving, the temperature change. But pay attention now to how both those greenhouse gases have really gone off the chart. CO2 is now over 400 parts per million, and CH3, methane, is also very high. So that's what's driving global warming. Those are greenhouse gases, they hold the heat in. This is the record now from the past about 160 years, and we can see there's been a lot of volatility, as we always see, but 2016 is projected to be a record global temperature. And this is consistent with the models that have been formulated by the climatologists. This is the worst case scenario, red, of temperature increasing almost 10 degrees, perhaps by 2100. That's if we do nothing aggressive to deal with our greenhouse gas problem. And the blue is a more conservative outcome if we were to aggressively reduce our greenhouse gases. Precipitation over here is not dramatically affected in the way the temperature is. So we're talking about a temperature increase, which is obviously driving heat. And oh, by the way, in western Washington, up until about the 13th of November of this year, there were record-breaking days in terms of heat. We know that 2015 was a record year here in the state of Washington. So heat is a reality. We know about the Paris Agreement from last year. We know that the president-elect has disavowed any interest in following this agreement. We know that the carbon tax law failed here in the state of Washington this year. And we know that various other sort of locally driven efforts are occurring. But in reality, if we go back to what, if any, effect it has on this line, I think the consensus among scientists that I've talked with is that it really is of little moment. So we've got a lot of work to do. So going back to fire. So the 2015 fire season was a record, and it affected communities all across the state of Washington. I tell this story because fire is a reality, and higher temperatures and drought that often come together are a reality, and it has a dramatic impact on people's lives. My home county here, Okanagan County, you can see, had many fires. There were fires over here in northeastern Washington, down here in southeast, and then fires from up here in northwestern Washington. If you didn't have a fire close to you, you were breathing smoke from a fire some distance away. So the reality is, and there was a bad fire down here by Mount Adams too, the reality is fire is going to be an ever increasing presence across our landscape, and fire is, of course, very destructive, as shown here by this slide from the Carlton Complex fire of 2014. That forest, and not to make light of it, is toast. And it will take over a century for that landscape to rebuild. When fire hits here and burns so hot, the soil is sterilized down about 5 or 6 inches, and it becomes hydrophobic, meaning it won't even accept water. So that makes it much more vulnerable to landslide, and it makes it very hard for any plants to reestablish themselves in a hydrophobic kind of environment. So fire is a reality. Our crews here, depicted on the left, have an enormous and very dangerous challenge of trying to contain wildfire when it gets to be of a big size. In 2015, the state of Washington spent over $180 million putting out wildfire. And I worked hard with the legislature following this fire season to convince them to invest more in pre-fire equipment, training, and staff, and they were very reluctant. I got about 20% of what I asked for. So the legislature hasn't been exactly very supportive. I mentioned how destructive fire has been. it also kills firefighters. So this is a scene from 2015, the Twist River fire. 3 U.S. Forest Service firefighters perished during that awful fire, and this is a convoy of ambulances carrying them to their final resting place. So it's a heavy thing for young folks, including I think there was one student from Whitman and other young folks who perished in that fire. So it's dangerous, and it takes people's lives. It also destroys property. This is a home that was destroyed near Wenatchee, another very destructive fire of 2015. And this is Scott, who was the owner of that home, who was relaxing on a Saturday afternoon in his home with his wife, saw a fire coming some distance away. It had been contained in the past, so they weren't really concerned. The wind was blowing really hard that day, and it just, in a moment, it came up the gully and consumed his home. They were lucky to escape with a few bare essentials. His home that he built 17 years ago and contained all the mementos of his family and his children's school years was gone in an instant. And many others like him have suffered the loss of their home. So the destruction of it is really profound. And if you or a family member hasn't experienced that, it's not quite as real. But when tragedy strikes people like that, it really alters their lives from that point forward. And frankly, that's what gives me energy. When I work before the legislature, when I advocate for more training, for more safety, it's because I know that we have to work so hard to keep the wildfires small and minimize their destruction. And that's going to be increasingly difficult with a warming climate. So this is Fernanda Santos. She is a Brazilian, a native Brazilian who moved to the U.S. some 20 years ago, learned English, and has become a New York Times reporter working out of Arizona. She's been following wildfires all across the western U.S. for several years and chronicled in the New York Times this coincident nature of increased fires here in the West and the fact that it's being driven by a warmer climate as a result of climate change. So she's a person that has used her talent as a writer to tell the story of the reality of what is happening. And today I'm going to speak about some others who have really made a difference in the whole discussion about the outcomes from climate. This is a very good writer, and she wrote a book which I encourage you to take a look at. It's called The Fire Line. Some of you may remember that in 2013, 19 firefighters died in Arizona defending a community in much the same way that the 3 firefighters perished defending homes at the Twist River fire. It's a really great recounting of the challenges and the danger of wildfire firefighters and how they're dedicated young people working hard and putting it all on the line for homes. It's really quite a story. So I want to transition now and talk a little bit about the legacy. And the legacy that was endowed upon the state here at statehood, you could see these dots. They all represent a section of land. At statehood, we were given 2 sections in every township to support education. So this was a brilliant stroke that the federal government was carrying out for each state at statehood. By the time we became a state in 1889, it was a little more generous early on in the whole process of land grant, and you've probably heard that term before. It was 1 section, but we entered fairly late, and so we got 2 sections. You can see these sections scattered all across the state. They've been blocked up, as we call, in western Washington state forests and some here in eastern Washington. Scattered in amongst these parcels are trust lands that were given for the benefit of this institution, for WSU. And as I told the dean today, I checked on our records. In fiscal year 2015, we, DNR, managed the ag and the scientific trust lands for the benefit of WSU to the tune of about $13 million. And we do that for the other trusts that we manage for, University of Washington, Evergreen State College, Western, Central, and Eastern, all qualify. In addition to the K through 12 construction account, so we support education through our management of this incredible portfolio that is our state's legacy, and in some ways, the best kept secret in the state. So, besides management and revenue production, we also regulate timber harvest and timber and road building on that number is slightly incorrect. It's really more like 13 million acres, sorry. We regulate the big forest landowners, Weyerhaeuser, Rainier, Sierra Pacific. All of them have to follow the rules, which are some of the most stringent rules for timber harvest in the nation. We're second only to California in how careful the environment is protected during those activities. So in addition, and I've mentioned already our firefighter responsibility, and you can see the lands that are under our protection are basically forested landscape, both in eastern Washington and more prevalently in western Washington, where there's a lot of private landowners that are in the foresting business. So we have this responsibility as a first responder. In addition, in years like this year, where we had many fires here in the central part of the state, which are not our primary responsibility, we still get involved because people want our help. We have aircraft, we have staff, so we often get called as a contractor to respond and support others' jurisdiction. So I've talked then about our responsibility as a land manager. I've talked about our responsibility as a firefighter and as a regulator. Back to fire here momentarily. We know about carbon emissions. We as a state emit about 100 million metric tons of carbon a year. That's right, 100 million metric tons. Primarily in transportation, which is almost half of the emissions. And then in a normal year, it's residential, commercial, and industrial, which comes in second. But in 2015, because of the tremendous amount of wildfire, it also was a big emitter. And so when you have the triple whammy of fatalities, property damage, and now this huge emission, which makes the situation even worse, it just cries out for involvement and a big effort to try and contain not only wildfire, but in doing so, trying to contain the amount of global warming that goes on. So I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about forestry. DNR manages about 2 million acres of forests all across the state. So we're the forestry agency for the state of Washington because we grow trees and we regulate timber harvest. Part of the challenge that we face is understanding what to do in the face of climate change. And to try and reach answers to that, I convened a panel called my Expert Council of scientists from all across the state of Washington, including 2 scientists from WSU, a couple from the University of Washington. I think the total panel was about 9. And one of the big conclusions that the panel recommended to myself and my staff in how to deal with the reality of climate was to increase diversity of species, whether it's in forest or whatever crop or system we're working with. This is a slide that flies in the face of that. So this is kind of a monoculture. It happens to be in our nursery outside Olympia, Washington, where we're preparing basically the seedlings to be planted out on trust lands after harvest. We always go back in after tree harvest and reseed. But I just show this. We really need to incorporate some of these principles. And one of them that I'm just mentioning, and I just suggest that you take this to heart, is that diversity is a theme that we will utilize and others will utilize. And here's the logic. The logic is that if you place your bet in one species or one subspecies, and it becomes vulnerable to a specific pest, you could really suffer grievous harm. And actually, today, in the state of Washington, wheat farmers are facing this problem because wheat varieties, of course, have been derived many years ago. And some of them were derived to meet all the pathogens that were present. There's a pathogen called leaf rust, which attacks the wheat plant. And the wheat breeders here at WSU and elsewhere, and I'll talk about them in a minute, have gone to a lot of trouble to bring in genes to resist leaf rust. But it's an arms race. And leaf rust has won this year. Why has it won in this particular year? Because it's a long, warm fall. And it's provided ample opportunity for the infection to spread into places it was never expected, and on varieties that were not armed to deal with it. So I'll come back to wheat in just a moment. But in the forested environment, I wanted to show you a picture of a more diverse forest landscape. So here we have multiple species. We have an opening in the forest. So it's not just one species. It's probably spruce, it's probably fir, it's probably more than that. And that's the kind of forest that's probably more resilient in the face of climate. So there are other things that we can do to make our landscape more resilient. And one of them is to reduce the fuels in the forests. So this is actually a picture taken from northeastern Washington, not far from here, in a stand of trees that suffered fire. But because this DNR staffer led a crew of a firefighting crew into here before the fire season and reduced the fuels by taking out the small trees and treating the ladder fuels, so there was no vector, no path for the fire to go from the ground up into the crown of the trees, where obviously it kills the tree. So this is the kind of work that we need to continue to do, is to make our landscapes resilient. In making them resilient here, they removed a lot of trees, and in doing that, they made sure there was ample moisture for the trees that remained, so to improve their forest health and make them more resistant to the pathogens that prey upon the weaker individuals. So there's multiple outcomes from this fuels reduction treatment. Our forests are special places, and many people love to hike within our forests. There's a sense of peace, a sense of well-being, a sense of returning to nature when you hike in a forest like this with a path going through this stately forest like this. People love to do this. Many of you in this room probably as well. So as a result of that, many have turned to building with wood. And of course, DNR, like many other landowners, raises wood. And we want to build the awareness of wood and its real benefit in terms of buildings. So not only can it make a building sort of visually attractive, it can also imbue a little bit of the sense of being in the forest because of the warmth and color and just presence of the wood. So this, of course, is wood paneling. But we're going a step further now and using a new product called cross-laminated timber, CLT. And that's a sophisticated beam that's made with cross-laminations to improve its strength and makes it much more like steel in terms of its resilience. But unlike steel, it's a locally produced product. Unlike steel, there's less embedded carbon in that wood beam. And unlike steel, it carries a warmth with it, particularly when it's exposed. I don't have a picture of an exposed CLT beam, but they're coming. And one of the unique things about CLT is that you can use really small diameter wood, like you get out of a thinning, or you get out of a restoration project. So there's lots of opportunity from CLT. So I mentioned some individuals, that I would talk about some individuals who made a difference across the state. Dr. Jerry Franklin, this individual here, is a renowned forest ecologist, really, from University of Washington, who's been a member of my expert council, has gone on many field trips with me across eastern Washington. He's a dedicated man, and he knows the value, and he knows some of the vulnerabilities in forest, and he knows that a managed forest is really a better forest. And he has stood up in public in many different places and taken heat from some that disagree with him. But he is really the dean of forestry in the Northwest, and he understands so much about both the dry forest here in eastern Washington and the wet forest in western Washington. He is a visionary about how to manage forests for the long term. Big ideas about resilience in Jerry Franklin. So as we all know, forests have had a task over many millennia of supporting species. And in the late 80s and early 90s, the vulnerability and the need for old-growth forests for the northern spotted owl became apparent. So this is one of the endangered species in the state of Washington. And as a result of that, DNR agreed in something called a habitat conservation plan to work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to set aside enough habitat for the species. So we have over half of western Washington forests that DNR manages are set aside for the benefit of the owl. Unfortunately, the thought was that the owl would be habitat limited, and that hasn't proven to be the case. There's another owl that has moved in from the East Coast, which is a strong competitor to the northern spotted owl. It's called the barred owl, and it has driven or killed many spotted owls here in the state of Washington. Currently, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is actually hunting barred owls, and it's a little bit of a, it's not a little bit, it's a very controversial control effort. But it just is, I wanted to tell this story a little bit because of DNR's involvement in our commitment to providing the habitat. But the sorry truth is habitat isn't enough to protect all species. Here is another species that we're working to provide protection for. It's called the marbled murrelet. Here it's at sea. It spends 95% of its time at sea and only ventures into forests to lay a single egg on a branch occasionally and raise its young. It will travel in as far as 40 miles to lay an egg on an old growth or older growth tree limb, and then carry prey, and it will dive up to 100 feet in the marine waters to capture prey to come and feed its young. It's a phenomenal bird, and DNR is currently working on some different alternatives, and Dr. Mittelheimer knows about this full well through his membership on the Board of Natural Resources, about sorting out which will be the best alternative to both meet our trust responsibility of providing revenue for schools and universities, as well as in balancing the conservation needs. So that's a difficult process for the Board of Natural Resources. So I want to shift gears back to eastern Washington a little bit. Some of you may recognize this is a shot taken near Red Mountain, which is becoming renowned for its wine production. And these are vineyards that have been planted over the last 20 years. This is an example of successful agriculture taking advantage of a warming climate. There are grape growers moving north from California because of the opportunities here and the certainty of irrigation water. The Columbia River is a very reliable form of water, and it helps produce a very high value crop such as wine grapes. So this industry, as we know, and WSU has specialized a lot in terms of developing the expertise to help growers be successful. This is one of those rare things that actually benefits from a warming climate. And I'll talk more about the effects on other crops here briefly. So here's another pioneer. This is Dr., I call him Bill, his initials are GW, Briel, who was actually a plant pathologist here at WSU for many years, and he worked on pathology, and he found that one of the problems in the northern tiers counties of eastern Washington for wheat growers was a disease called snow mold. And he actually went to Siberia, and he found a grass there that could withstand long-term survival under snow cover. And through a process called introgression, meaning moving a gene through intermediate species, he was able to bring genes from Siberia into wheats that were productive in eastern Washington to help the wheat survive under long snow cover. I tell this story because of his pioneering understanding that you often have to go elsewhere to find genetic characteristics that will help you be successful in the future. And I would just suggest that we may be, and actually it may be happening now, scientists from WSU going to the warmer planets to find genes that will help plants survive under warmer conditions. The reality is the climate's real. The climate's destructive. And temperatures are certain to increase. And so our ability to endow those crops that we can with the resilience to survive under these higher temperatures is important, just like Bill did with snow mold. So a wheat was named after him in recognition of his pioneering efforts. So it's an example, yet again, of the successful plant breeding program here at WSU. It's world class, no question about it. So here I am out on a dryland field, not far from the Columbia River, down near an area called Plymouth, which is not far from Bickleton. And we're talking about, and this was this year, and the crop was an unusual dryland crop. It was a very good year because there was ample rainfall this year. But we know that we can't count on rain every year. So we are engaged now in a large development of irrigation project down in that area where we're bringing water from the Columbia River for a water permit that was given to the state of Washington, DNR, in the late 70s and hasn't been acted upon. And that's a very valuable asset. And I have been working for a long period of time to prove up that water right. But to do it, we have to build a pipeline about 40 inches in diameter, about 8 miles, to bring the water from the Columbia River up to the test rates, which are about 400 feet above the water of the river level. So this is yet again another example of how DNR is working to provide revenue for education in the many years ahead. And we know that water availability is a major factor. And so we're working for the betterment and for the interests of education in the future by providing that water. I'm going to go back over to the other side of the Cascades again. So we're back over here in the Puget Sound. And just a view of the Puget Sound, of course, Mount Rainier in the distance there, a reminder about how precious the Puget Sound is and how many iconic species are there as well as in our state's forest. This, of course, is an orca, which is an endangered species there, which depends on salmon and other prey to be able to survive. We know that one of the outcomes from climate is increased carbon dioxide entering the marine waters and changing the pH of the water. And just as heat on the landscape is affecting all biota, the pH in the water is affecting all life. So we're trying to, we, DNR, because we manage all of the bedlands of every navigable body of water in the state for the benefit of the public, including the bedlands of the Puget Sound. And we know that there is a very large and very successful fishery here in the bedlands of the Puget Sound involving geoducks and other biota that's commercially valuable. So this is a shot. This is just a shot of eelgrass at lower tide, and eelgrass is like the foundational habitat. It provides shelter for many organisms when the tide comes in, and it also provides a very important buffer for the acidifying marine waters because it's a carbon fixer. And so when the tide is in, it fixes carbon out of the marine water and hence raises the pH. In times past, there was a lot more eelgrass in the Puget Sound than there is now. So part of our efforts at DNR are to restore as much of the nearshore environment to the eelgrass population from times gone past. Because we know that it has a positive impact both in terms of providing habitat, but also important in the whole battle around climate. When you think about it, it's really hard to affect the pH of the water. And so this is one of the ways that DNR has strategized to do whatever we can by increasing the acreage of eelgrass. So, talking about Western Washington, I have to bring up, of course, you all know there are many tribes, many Native American tribes that reside in Western Washington. One of them is Lummi Nation. Jay here is a unique individual who is a Lummi, as we say, who has had a really interesting life trajectory. He was raised on Lummi Nation, which is over near Bellingham, and they've been traditionally very dependent on the marine waters for their well-being. Traditional food were fish, shellfish, and the bounty from the water. So his parents before him were fisher people. And when he raised up in that family, like many other young folk, he didn't really get it. And so he went off to the big city. He went off to LA to make his fortune in the gambling business. The time went on in LA, and he found that it was less and less fulfilling for him. And finally, he made a momentous decision to come home. So he's at home now, and he's fishing. He's a crabber. This is his boat in the background. He's a successful crabber. But he's also become an elected member of the governing body of Lummi Nation. And he's been an outspoken person advocating for the acknowledgement of the treaty rights of the Lummi Nation. And so they've been having this long dialogue with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And a Corps permit is required for any major facility on the Puget Sound where a dock would go on. And there was proposed a large dock called the Fort Dock there on Cherry Point on the ancestral fishing grounds of Lummi. And Lummi and Jay protested that vigorously before the U.S. Army Corps. And on May 9th of this year, their efforts were rewarded. And the Corps turned down the permit that would have been required to build the dock that would have exported coal to Asia. So Jay, like Lummi, are doing their best to make sure that as little coal is burned globally. Because as we know, if coal goes over from here, from North America to China, and it's burned over there, we know about the westerlies, so we know where those emissions are going to come. So everybody is doing what they can to try and deal with climate. And Jay and Lummi have been successful on one end. So this is a picture of the nearshore environment here on the Puget Sound. You can see members of Puget Sound Corps. They've got these iridescent vests on. They're scattered all around here, working with the public on the cleanup and recovery of the Puget Sound. There's always a lot of debris that's here, often fishing gear, often legacy equipment and material that floats in. And it's all an impediment to the recovery of this treasured body of water. So it's great that the public is involved, but I wanted to call your attention to Sound Corps because often we and the Department of Ecology employ college students as well as veterans. So it's a great entry-level activity where you can learn about the cleanup and recovery and what it's like to work together as a team, reinstilling resilience. They often are planting plants back on on the nearshore environment where the plants have been killed or otherwise eliminated. So it's a really good primer, and they do lots of really interesting things like counting different fish species, measuring the pH. So there's lots of fundamental science going on. So it's a great learning opportunity. So finally, I have to mention Billy Frank Jr., who was a tribal leader of great renown for over 50 years, was involved in the effort to really solidify and recognize the tribe's treaty rights to 50% of the harvest of fish and shellfish there in Puget Sound. He was a real rebel in his day, and he was imprisoned perhaps over 50 times as he would intentionally break the law to call attention to how the law was not in recognizance to the treaty rights that were established in 1855, and which by treaty guaranteed the right of tribes to harvest in their usual and accustomed location in commons with the people of the state. And that's been interpreted to mean a 50% share. So this is an individual I had the privilege to know before he passed about 2 years ago. In recognition of his impact, the Nisqually Wildlife Refuge was renamed this past year by an act of Congress to recognize Billy Frank Jr. for his many contributions. And one of his many teachings, as well as other tribal leaders, is really a model, I think, to respect and to think about. And that is to recognize and think back fully 7 generations, what our ancestors did to bring us here, and to try and think ahead as best we can to what the next 7 generations deserve and are counting on us for. And with that, this is our home, this is our future. We need to take care of it. Thank you all.
We have time for questions that the Commissioner will attempt to answer, so please, let's have some.
Yes, ma'am.
Have you talked to President-elect Trump?
So the question is, have I talked to President-elect
about all
Trump?
this?
And the answer is no. I think he has a pretty crowded schedule right now, and I'm not sure that that my presence would be recognized. Perhaps my successor. By the way, I have testified before Senate committees. I've dialogued tremendously with members of Congress about many issues. And just this morning I was talking with EPA. So this office has, as you can tell from the responsibilities, has many opportunities to engage, and it is important. Engagement is important with the federal government. I agree. Good point. Yes, ma'am.
You talked about water supply for your irrigation projects. How does that meet with the movement where they want to remove the dams?
So I don't think, so the irrigation project is really more dependent upon a reliable supply. And luckily we have this permit which goes back to the late 70s. So there's some priority there, which is important. I don't think water supply is going to be affected at all by the dams. That would impact the commerce down the Snake River. And as a wheat grower, I know that many growers depend on cheap barge tariffs that are only possible with those dams. That the choices between barge and rail or truck, and in part, you should look at the carbon emissions from those different routings. And yet I know at the same time, the tribes, many tribes, as well as many environmentalists want to see those dams gone. I just have to ask the question. If they want those dams gone, what about the ones on the main stem too, that we all depend on every day for electricity? It's a problem, and we're going to have to solve it somehow. Yes, over here.
Before you leave this particular issue, the carbon tax initiative failed. There were included a number of organizations that had lots of doubts about how together. Do you have any particular suggestions on how that in fact may have been could be rewritten and brought back that would pass?
So that's a great question. The question is really I-732, which is really a tax swap, tax on carbon and less tax on other things. Maybe why that failed and what's going to happen in the vacuum of that. Well, actually, I think it failed because it did not garner support from the broader environmental community, and there was concern that it might have a negative impact on the state budget. There was thinking that it might create an $800 million hole over 6 years. So that created a lot of doubt, and it failed. And it failed also because the money wasn't used to mitigate for damage. So there's another organization called the Washington Alliance, and it's an assembly of lots of different groups that is coming forward with a different plan, and I encourage you can find it through Google. It's just the Washington Alliance, and it proposes to create revenue, but reinvest it in clean water, reinvest it in low-income families, reinvest it in sustainable forestry. So it's trying not only to generate revenue, but to put it to work to try and reduce emissions. Yes, ma'am.
Is there a lot of tension in the DNR between their need to generate funds for the public schools and to conserve natural resources?
So the question is there a lot of tension in DNR about creating revenue versus conservation, basically?
Yeah.
And I will say that there's not, because we have an incredible commitment to both. We know that the only way we can generate revenue from forested lands is through our commitment to endangered species. And that's a commitment around conservation. And we really live it. Under my commissionership, I've added over 100,000 acres to conservation. 52,000 in the Teanaway Forest alone. So that was under private ownership before, and now it's in this unique community forest that's being managed by two state agencies, by DNR and by WDFW, the State Department of Fish and Wildlife. And the community group has formulated the management plan. In addition, I forged a really unusual agreement with the U.S. Navy on the western shore of Hood Canal to provide conservation there and to provide certainty for Navy operations there as well. I could go on. I'm proud, as many other commissioners before me, to do both and to be successful at both. I think it's important to recognize, and this is important, that as this university articulates its commitment to working landscapes, DNR articulates its commitment to working landscapes. We know that our rural communities depend upon us. We know that the school children and the universities depend on us. And so we do the job in a sustainable conservation manner. It can be done, and we are doing it. Yes, sir.
The next commissioner, what have you suggested they do?
So I haven't really had an opportunity to dialogue with the commissioner-elect thus far. I will be during the upcoming transition period, which will start in the near future and continue, I think, probably until that person is sworn in. So that'll be an opportunity for the commissioner-elect and some of her staff to get briefed by my staff and myself about what's going on. Because you can glean a certain amount of that from our website and from public release, but there are lots of things kind of in the works that aren't necessarily well known. But we'll bring, just like the transition that's happening at the federal level, we are there to help the new administration of DNR be successful, and that's my intention.
Commissioner Perspectives question. Earlier in the talk, you showed us some rather startling graphs over hundreds of thousands of years that produced unprecedented temperature rises. What is it about this issue that is so difficult for us as a society, for us as legislators, to get our head around it and react to it?
So Ron was asking about why is it so hard for our culture, for our society to really grapple with the reality of what climate is saying, because as those graphs show, I mean, methane, CO2, the major drivers, and oh, by the way, now we have the hydrofluorocarbons that we were told that we were going to replace Freon with, but now, oh, too bad, we find out they're real climate gases as well. So why is it so hard to convince people? And I'll just go to my own personal experience in dealing with the legislature. Following 1 million acres burned in 2015, I approached the legislature in January, and they deliberated on my request until April. But guess what the weather's like during that period of time? Is there fire burning? No. Is everybody yammering at them about other issues? About health care, about homelessness, about education? Those are the present and current problems that they're being assaulted with. And I put it, assault. Fire? Well, there's this one guy over here, so don't pay any attention to him. He's talking about something that may happen in the future, and it's not an immediate threat because there's no fire burning at the time. And it was true even in the preceding year, in 2014, when that Sleepy Hollow fire burned into Wenatchee. They were still in session, and they still didn't give me the money I needed, despite the fact that it burned 30 homes and threatened people's lives. So the long way around here is to say that it really takes a big current, obvious threat. And people don't necessarily get it by looking at a graph. You, as a scientist, get it. Others in the room get it. But does that demand people's immediate attention? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And obviously, the president-elect is a denier. So that's a little disconcerting. Yes, sir.
Commissioner, a brief comment and then a question. I'm really glad you pointed out the important role that Billy Frank played in our state. My proudest accomplishment as WSU faculty member was I was instrumental in inviting him and his biographer, Charles Wilkinson, to campus to tell that story about 8 or 9 years ago before we lost him. It was one of the greatest moments, I think, on our campus in my lifetime. My question is, you know, the fire problem is very complex. One of the areas of complexity is one of the ironies is that the fact that fire has not been able to play its natural role in some forest ecosystems has actually increased the risk of catastrophic fire. This has been recognized by the Forest Service perhaps a bit more in the past than it has by DNR. Does DNR have any plans to restore fire to its more natural role as a way of mitigating the risk of catastrophic fire?
So I hope everybody heard that question, because I'm not going to repeat it. But the contrast is, and please understand a couple of things. One thing is that this year, 90% of the fires were human caused. That's not natural. And in a normal year, it's about 2/3 of the fires. So humans are adding a lot of risk. Second of all, the Forest Service land, by very nature, doesn't have homes in it. And for the most part, it's remote. And I can understand that it's not worth putting a wildland firefighter's life at risk or anything like that, and that because of the budget realities, it may be their only management tool. I get that. But there's also risk attached to that, and we saw it on the fire that was the Wolverine fire up by Lake Chelan. Now that fire burned sort of untended for about 3 weeks, until the heat came up and the wind came up, and then it took off and it roared towards Tehican, and it threatened the smaller communities nearby. I flew in that area after the fire was out, and the slopes are like this. They're like 60, 70 degrees, and everything on the slope is gone. We all know where the soil's going to end up. It's going to end up down in the lake, and it's going to take centuries upon centuries to rebuild enough humus and enough substance in that landscape to restore the trees. Now, DNR has a different responsibility because by law, we are protecting property from damage. So we don't really have a choice. because the landowners pay a fee in with the expectation that we will put the fire out. Not only that, but most of the time, there are homes within close proximity to the fire. Now, a little known fact, the Twist River fire, and where those 3 firefighters perished, that was not on Forest Service land. That was on private land. And the Forest Service does work with us and with local protection districts to put out fire. But that wasn't their jurisdiction. They were helping more because they're a great partner, and we're very appreciative of that. But there are different goals between the different firefighting agencies. It's just like the local municipal one here. You know, do they make a decision when the fire call comes in? Are we going to put that fire out or not? Nope, their responsibility is put that fire out, and they do their best to do it. And that's our charge, and that's what we do. Will we use prescribed fire in the future to try and lessen the risk?
That's what I'm really talking about.
Absolutely. Will we carry out fuels treatment to cut down the risk before we can do the prescribed fire? Absolutely. Those treatments are expensive to make it safe to do the prescribed fire. But we will do that, and many others will do it. But it's incredibly expensive. It's not a magic solution. There'll still be lots of fire on the ground. Great question. Yes, sir.
What do you think it's going to take to change from a reactionary society to one that's preventative in many cases like this? Because a lot of times we only change when something catastrophic happens.
It's a great question. Sitting in a world-class educational institution. I think the answer is obvious. Education. That's the key to moving our society forward. And I assume you're making use of that opportunity. And I wish there were more people who do that. There's no magic bullet, but education is the path. Yes?
I might be mistaken, but I've heard that a lot of our methane levels come from landfills. Is that correct, or is this like a minuscule thing compared to something else but not methane?
So the question is about methane levels coming from landfills. And so I've done some research in the literature. Methane comes from many sources, including landfills, including cows, including the Arctic, which is warming and a lot of decomposition is happening there. It comes from many different sources. It comes from methyl hydrates in the floor of the ocean, where lots of methane gas is stored and is at risk of being released by warmer oceanic temperatures. So there's lots of methane that's been tied up in many different forms that if the temperatures continue to rise, it could be a accelerated process. That's why we have to do what we can now. Great question. Yes, ma'am.
What's the most meaningful thing you've been able to accomplish during your time with DNR, and what do you hope to accomplish moving forward onto your next adventure?
Great question. So what do I feel is my best achievement while working at DNR, and what do I intend to do going forward? So one thing, actually two things. One thing is really being there for the school children and the universities of this great state. Many people get revenue from our work and they don't even know about it. Libraries, police departments, hospitals, road crews, colleges, universities, remote schools, and they don't know about it. And so that's part of the big challenge, is really letting people know what we do and the checks we send them. And second of all, some of the innovative conservation efforts that I've been involved in. This 52,000 acre brand new community forest, never done by the state ever before, such as this really innovative easement with the U.S. Navy, which really is providing incredible conservation value because it's preventing a large gravel mine from shipping barges up and down the Puget Sound, and hence protecting species and protecting the Navy from intrusion of those vessels at the same time. So wherever you can get a win-win, wherever there's a win both for the community and for the people from Seattle to come over and recreate, wherever you can help provide for the protection of our nation and the protection of a really treasured ecosystem at the same time, that's where the value is. Yes, sir.
I believe that the Columbia Basin project, the cost of the water there is quite a bit more than the users can pay for. I think that's been shown by
So which project costs more?
the Columbia Basin project. The one.
It's expensive.
So my question is about the other water project you're talking about, and is that going to be taxpayer subsidized as the Columbia Basin project is, or are the users going to be able to pay the cost of that project?
So the question is about the what's going to support that project that I described in terms of bringing water from the Columbia River up on the trust lands. And the answer is it's going to be paid for by the lessees. It's going to be paid for by the revenue that's gained from the irrigated lands, and that will come to this institution and others as a result of that trust revenue, because the land that's being irrigated is trust land, and the revenue will go to the people of the state. So it's not going to be paid for out of the general fund at all, and it's not subsidized.
Commissioner, a call to arms. What can we do?
So, the call to arms, thank you for that. I tried to make the point at several times during my presentation. I showed you 3 different individuals who've made an incredible difference through their lives. One's a wheat breeder, one's a member of Lummi Nation, and one was a journalist. It's a wealth of opportunities for people in many different careers to make a difference, to bring awareness, to help support efforts to cut down emissions, to do so in your private lives, but to do so in your professional lives. And only when we all work together, and we've seen in past endeavors, can we be successful. So thank you for your attention, and thank you for your future efforts. It's been my pleasure.